Hi guys, Ricky Pope here, and this week on the Christian Nerd Unite podcast, we're joined by Colossal Studios. Jason Moody, the creator of Gabriel and the Guardians, writer and showrunner David Cunningham, and production manager and former Disney animator Al Moore. Plus, scripture and nerdy news, and we'll get to all of that right after this.
Hey guys, this is Ashley Cox from Fangirling Over Jesus. At FOJ, we believe in hope and light in the darkness and that you are not alone. We seek to unite and celebrate the intersection of the gospel and our favorite fandoms, and we get to do this through our social media, our podcast devotional, and our cosplay and fashion. And you can find links to all of that through our website, www.fangirlingoverjesus.com, through our social media at Fangirlingoverjesus, wherever you get your podcasts, and on Etsy. See you online.
And lead me on to your kingdom come, surrendering, let your work be done. My life I give for the glory of your Son.
Thanks so much for joining us every week on the Christian Nerd Unite podcast. You, the listener, are the reason I do this. We're also part of the Christian Nerd HQ podcast network, so make sure you go follow all those podcasts as well at christiannerdhq.com. Well, let's read some scripture. Ephesians 6:10-17. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armor of God so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand. Stand firm then with the belt of truth buckled around your waist, with the breastplate of righteousness in place, and with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. In addition to all this, take up the shield of faith with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. When we watch superheroes, we often see them battle forces that the general public doesn't know about, protecting the world that is unaware. As Christians, we stand with the full armor of God: truth, righteousness, readiness of the gospel of peace, faith, salvation, and the word of God. We fight against unseen armies in our lives. Our prayers are a form of spiritual warfare, pushing back the dark. Sharing the gospel spreads the light of hope to a dark world that does not yet know that it's in peril. I pray that this week you'll spend some time praying for those around you who are needing to know God. Your prayers really do make a difference. Now for some nerdy news. There were 4 new releases this week in the top 5 at the box office this weekend. Paw Patrol: The Mighty Movie took first place with $23 million domestically and $47 million worldwide. Saw 10 came in second with $18 million domestically. Third is Disney's new release, The Creator. The Nun 2 dropped to 4th place, and the new biopic, The Blind, based on the true story of Phil and Kay Robertson, rounds out the top 5 with $4 million domestically. Sad news, Sir Michael Gambon passed away this week. The statement from the family said, beloved husband and father, Michael, died peacefully in the hospital with his wife Anne and son Fergus at his bedside, following a bout of pneumonia. Gambon is probably best known for taking over the part of Professor Dumbledore in the Harry Potter films following the death of Richard Harris. He was a prolific actor in Britain. Well, this week I'm joined by Colossal Studios, by the art director Jason Moody, writer and showrunner David Cunningham, and production manager and former Disney animator Al Moore. We discuss their new production, Gabriel and the Guardians, that is still in development and funding. We talked for so long, I decided to go ahead and split this one up into 2 episodes. So make sure you check back next week for the second half. Now let's get right into our interview. Colossal Studios, it is so great to have you on the Christian Nerds Unite podcast today.
Thank you,
Thanks
man.
for having us.
We're glad to be here.
Well, before we get started, because a lot of people may not be familiar with who you guys are, why don't you just really quick give us your names, what is your position with the company, and then we'll kind of take it from there.
Cool. I am Jason Moody. I am what am I? President of Colossal Studios, I guess. Titles don't matter.
And they don't matter.
But,
Art director, creator.
Art director. I work as art director, creator of Gabriel and the Guardians. So,
Yeah.
Al?
Yeah, Al Moore, head of production. One of the founders. Great group of guys. Fun project.
Yeah, David Cunningham. Title on the show is showrunner, same with these guys, founder of the show. So yeah.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, we're definitely going to dive into Colossal Studios, and we're going to dive into Gabriel and the Guardians, your upcoming production,
Our flagship.
your flagship. So let's start with. How did you guys get to this point? And this is kind of an animated series. So did you guys come out of animation? Where did all this kind of come from?
Yeah, half and half, I think. And I will say that it's easy to call something your flagship when it is the only thing you've done. So I say flagship, but really I mean the only thing we've done so far. I don't come out of animation, actually. I come out of so I was a media developer for JP Morgan Chase for 15 years, and then I was a worship leader. So I was doing lots of worship, leading worship at my local vineyard church, and then I was part of a movement that was about sort of unity worship, drawing together the various churches in our city for worshiping together once a month, and so that was something I was doing very regularly, deeply involved in. And then when COVID hit, we couldn't gather. And the whole thing was like, let's gather, you know. And then literally the city was like, you can't, you know what I mean? And I was like, oh, well, that sucks. So with a terrible amount of time on my hands, I started dreaming. Idle minds, right, and idle hands. Mm-hmm. And my wife and I really got into a podcast called the Bible Project Podcast. And Tim Mackey is the guy that does that, mm-hmm. And Jonathan Collins, I think. And just absolutely fascinating. We fell in love with this podcast, and it really focused on Genesis. And I grew up in the church. My dad was a pastor, but I grew up in a very sort of traditional evangelical church that focused heavily on the New Testament and not much on the Old Testament. And so Genesis just came alive to me in a way I just never had connected to it before. And I mean, my imagination was just running wild. And, after, a year into COVID, I had this concept on my hands. And I didn't know what to do with it, to be honest, because I just am not from the industry. I don't know anything. I didn't know anybody. But there was a moment when I love anime. I grew up watching anime. My daughter also, coincidentally, thanks to me, into anime. And, so she looks at the stuff that I'm working on, and she was like, Dad, this is an anime about the Bible that I actually watch. And I was like, oh, really? And I just felt this thing on my back. I just felt this thing that pressed on my spirit that was like, yeah, like there's a way to reveal the beauty of these texts to a generation and an audience that wouldn't look at it otherwise. That wouldn't even consider these narratives. And so I hit LinkedIn, man, because I didn't know what else to do. I was like, okay, I feel that this is supposed to be a thing I'm supposed to be doing. And so I started just messaging people on LinkedIn, randomly. And, you hit enough people and eventually someone's going to take pity on you. And a producer of a show called Superbook responded.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and he was like, hey, he definitely was like, I take pity on this guy, and took it, and he was like, I'll take a look at your pitch. I was like, thank you. All I want is notes, you know what I mean? I just want to know if this is something. And after about 10 minutes, man, he got back with me, and he was like, hey, here's my phone number. I want you to give me a call. I was like, oh, okay. This is like the first real bite that I'd gotten. And I gave him a call, and he was like, the first thing it was like, so what have you worked on? And I'm like, bank training? I was like, that's what I've worked on. Like, you don't work on a show or anything? I was like, nope. And he was like, really? I was like, no. And he was like, well, this is a really good pitch. This is really good. And I was like, really? And he was like, yeah. He wanted to help. He was like, I'd love to help. He's like, I can't do it officially as with what I do, but I can just, as someone that works in the industry, I'd love to try to connect you with people and help. And that first call, he like prayed with me. He's an amazing person. And he ended up mentioning David. And so I reached out to David on LinkedIn, and that's probably where I should hand the story off, right, David? That's where his story picks up,
Yeah. So this was like this was January of 2022, right? Yeah. January last year.
Okay.
And I got a random message from this guy that I didn't know on LinkedIn. And I think you said something like, I heard you're a writer. Could you help me write a story? And I think I messaged you back, and then I just said, who are you? And how did you hear about me?
Yeah.
I was like, who is, you get I'm a little bit of a skeptical person by nature.
They
Rightly so.
I think your next message was like, what Arabian princess are you trying to get me to send money to?
I was kind of waiting for there to be something like, some kind of scam. I'm a little bit like, like that. But no, like Jason was just like, I just got this thing. And then he mentioned who he talked to, and I was like, oh, I know that guy, and I was like, yeah. And so then, we jumped on a call and, talked through it. And I think the first thing that happened basically was Jason was like, just, can you take a look at this script and let me know what you think? Give me any notes that you might have. And so I was like, yeah, okay. I'll do it. So I read the script, and I had a few notes. I had quite a few notes. And I remember thinking like, oh, like if I send all these notes back, it's probably going to crush him. And I was like, but I might as well go ahead and do it.
I don't know.
And what was it?
Just crush his dreams now. Get it over with.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. What was really cool though is that I thought I would never hear from him again. I thought I'm going to send all these notes back, and he's going to be like, okay, see ya. But instead, he gets back to me and he's like, these are really good notes. And he was like, wow, this is really interesting. And so then we just started, we started working together. Just really kind of sporadically at first. And then, slowly over time, just kind of, worked more and more. And to jump back a little bit and give you background on me, I was actually working at Superbook when Jason contacted me with Al. Al and I worked together at Superbook. So I started at Superbook in 2015, and which was for me, getting here has been like a 16-year journey. I was living out in the wilderness, literally the wilderness in Colorado at 9,000 feet at a little tiny Bible school retreat center in the middle of nowhere. And I remembered I was praying and I was asking God what He wanted me to do, and I was reading through. Oh man, I'm gonna get this wrong. I believe it is. I'm gonna get this. It's either Exodus 31 or Exodus 32. The chapter that describes the Spirit of the Lord came on the builder of the temple. I can't remember if that's 31 or 32 right now. But it struck me so hard. This was 2007. This was like June 2007. And it just hit me so hard that God cares about beautiful things, that God cares about art, that God cares about creating good art and about telling stories. And when I read that God's Spirit came on the builder of the temple, then it goes on to describe the beauty of the temple, and I was like, oh, like this is really important stuff. And so for me, like it was like 2007. Took me about, I guess, like 8 years to get into the industry, and that was kind of like a long path. And then I started working at Superbook, which was also just like a random thing. I went to grad school for film producing, and I just happened to go to a grad school that was right across the street from where they were making Superbook, and I didn't know that until like I had been there for 6 months. Somebody was like, "Oh, they're making an animated series over there." I was like, "Oh, I always wanted to get into animation," and I was like, "Ah, that's interesting," and then happened to get a job there. and so it was a really interesting path. So then to fast forward again back up to when I met Jason, we basically worked together for a few months. I think like maybe like 5 or 6 months or so, something like that. And we were working on getting together a pilot script. Like, okay, what's the first episode of this thing, and like, what's it going to look like? What's it going to feel like? Who are the characters going to be? And so we get together a pilot script and we kind of start sharing it. And one of the people that I shared it with was Al. Al, you want to pick up from there?
Yeah. So, unbeknownst to anyone here, well, actually, unbeknownst to Jason, that we all knew. Well, I guess you knew at this point that David knew him, but I also knew the guy who was talking to Jason early on. In fact, he brought it out to David and I. We were standing in the doorway of David's office, and he brought the thing over to us in the beginning, and we were both, David and I were kind of like, not sure about this project, but but it's
Very
funny,
skeptical.
very skeptical. But it was very funny because, like David said, he had been working on it for a while. He reached out to me out of the blue, and he's like, "Hey man, I've got this script I want you to read." And I'm like, he goes, "I've been working on it, and I just want you to read it and just let me know what you think about it." So I said, like, "Cool, man, I'll read it." So, so I got about a third of the way through it, and I was like, "Wow, this thing is really cool." And well, anyway, I'll get through that story. So I was like, "This is really cool." So I called him up, and I was like, "Hey," I asked him a few questions. I don't remember what the questions are now, but I asked him a few questions, and his answers were like dead on the money. And then I finally he started to talk about something. I go, wait, stop. And he's like, "Okay." And I said, "I got a question for you, and one more question." And he's like, "Oh, what is it?" And I said, "How do I get involved in this?" He goes, "It's funny you should ask, because I was just getting ready to ask you if you wanted to be involved." So yeah, my background. Well, and funny, let me roll back just for a second. I didn't realize this was the same project that during the pandemic, or literally just before the pandemic, we were talking about standing in that office doorway. And it was some months later that Jason and we were all talking. We were like, "What? You knew about that?" It was so funny that
it wasn't long ago, actually. Like just a few months ago, you guys were telling me this story. You were like, "Yeah, our boss showed us this thing," and we were all like, you don't do random projects with people that message you on LinkedIn, dude." It's like, you're kidding me. You guys were there when
we were right there in the beginning, and we were telling him stuff, and then he was going into his office and telling you back stuff we were saying. I started laughing, but I didn't know that was happening until you told us your side of the story. And I was like, "Wait a minute, that's the stuff David and I were saying." So it's just
it's funny because I didn't know that was you, Jason, for a while either. Like I didn't make the connection because I didn't like, I don't know if I saw the stuff back then. It was this weird disconnect where I was like, this can't be the same person.
It had definitely gone through an iteration, because in between there, actually the producer that we all know. I don't know if he wants us to say his name, so
Nah, we probably should.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
but
the producer who shall remain unnamed.
Yeah, the producer that yeah, what he said. But anyway, through him and kind of through a suggestion, I ended up getting connected with Devon Franklin, who does has Franklin Entertainment, and they did like Miracles from Heaven and Breakthrough and The Star, and basically kind of through he put it in my mind to reach out to them, but then I was like, oh, I said, so you have a connection? He was like, no, I don't know them. And he was like, this would be a great project. I think they'd be interested in it. And I was like, oh, okay. Any other suggestions of people that you don't know but think that they, I was like, but I was like, you know what? Actually, I know exactly what to do with this. I will just cold email them. You know what I mean? That's what I did. I looked around on the internet and found Devon Franklin's email, and hoped that it was real, and sent him an email. And like four weeks later, I didn't hear anything, man. But like 4 or 5 weeks later, I got an email from the VP of television at Franklin Entertainment, and they were like, hey, Devon Franklin saw your pitch, got your email, and thinks this is a really great idea, and we want to work with you. And so I actually for a few months developed the show with them, and so by the time I went back to David, it had been developed, right, in an actual studio for a few months, and so it had gone through some changes. Yeah. Anyway, Al, you were about to talk about pedigree.
Yeah, my pedigree. So what's funny is, the reason why I was like so excited about the project was, one, the story was good, but two is that like I was at Disney for 14 years. I worked there in the 90s in 2D animation. I worked on Lion King, Pocahontas, stuff like that. A lot of films.
Very cool.
And,
probably haven't heard of them.
Yeah, and some small films that you've never heard of. But while I was there, I had always wanted to do something, Christian based that was, allegorical, that was like high fantasy. And I'm not saying we're high fantasy, but it just was like perfect because again, like David said, it was like 15, 16 years for him. It was like 20 some odd years for me that, this vision, this dream of working on those kinds of things had been, birthed inside of me. And originally I say, I went to Superbook because I thought that was what was going to happen there. In my mind, I was like, we're going to make, great stuff for the teen market, and that was the other thing, is the teen market. I felt like the teen market's been underserved for a long time. And so I was like, we're going to be in the teen market. This is going to be fantastic. But then we skewed, much younger than the teen market with Superbook. And so it wasn't really what I'm not saying I'm proud of what we did. The shows that we've done, it's great. But, this is really where I've wanted to be for a long time.
Yeah, and I can say too, I think one thing that's interesting about the three of us is that we all love anime, and I think we've all watched anime for a long time. I know, like Jason. I think Jason and I probably started watching anime about the same time. I started on Dragon Ball. Actually, the first anime that I ever saw was one that I would never recommend anybody to see, but it was the original Vampire Hunter D, which is like it's very hard R. I would not recommend. I would not recommend kids watching it. I would not recommend.
Yeah, for
kids
sure.
watching it. But
7. No, I'm just kidding.
7.
Yeah.
Yeah. At least
Yeah, no. But
let him watch Vampire Hunter D.
The thing for me, and I think this is Al and Jason. I know these guys are right there with me. Is that we all saw content like anime content. But then, stuff like Batman, the animated series, X-Men, the animated series in the 90s. And it was like cool stuff. And it was like, why is there nothing coming from a Christian perspective that's cool? It's all like, especially in the 90s, it was all like super cheesy. And it was super kind of ridiculous. And it was like, as a kid, I was like, my parents, I grew up in a Christian home, and my parents always put, like Christian stuff in front of me, and it was like, this isn't cool. I don't want to watch this. Like,
David, are you saying that you didn't like Bible Man, dude?
yeah, no, I did not like Bible Man. I remember my parents really wanted me to watch those. If you guys remember the '90s Carmen music videos, I don't know if you guys.
Oh,
remember.
yeah.
They had a lot of those for some reason. But
Luke's invitation. Oh
yeah. So no, it was always a thing where it was like, why can't we make something that's actually cool, something that would actually we would actually want to watch when we were teenagers, And that's kind of like
here's what's funny about Carmen, man. It was for sure cheesy, but something about it I loved. I actually made my own. I took the Carmen music videos and then I made my own version of the Carmen music videos. Like I would find the one part in the song that had open music and then just loop that over and over and over again so I could make my own song, and then I'd make my own music videos to Carmen music videos. Yeah. It was weird.
As you do.
That's funny.
As you did when you were a Christian kid in the 90s.
That's right.
Yeah.
My kids in the 90s were watching VeggieTales, right? Wasn't that the 90s, right?
Yeah,
we were driving the van, and I would hear it coming from behind me. So.
VeggieTales was cool. I don't know. For me, VeggieTales was actually something that me and my teenage friends would go to the Christian bookstore for the VHS release parties of VeggieTales. Every time a new VHS of VeggieTales came out, we went and they'd do a party and we'd go to screen it, And
yeah.
There's a very unique
oh my goodness.
specific Christian 90s youth group nostalgia that I have.
Yeah.
See that was the thing. I think that my parents could not get me to go to a youth group. It just I was a very cynical child. I was a very cynical teenager. I was watching when I discovered Cowboy Bebop. That was mine was being blown. Seeing that series for the first time. I think right when it came out. I think I saw it in '98. And I was I remember buying the VHS tapes from Suncoast. Back when Suncoast existed.
That's a name I haven't heard in a long time.
Yeah, I got into, in my day, it was called Japanimation.
Right, yeah.
Through Robotech in the mid 80s.
Oh, yeah.
So
Yeah.
that was my first adventure. Well, technically, I watched Battle of the Planets.
Yeah.
The best. Gotcha,
I had
man.
to make sure I
the
said it
best.
right.
The best.
The old rewrite
Yes.
of Gotcha Man, G-Force.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I grew up in the 70s. So that's
so we
where I got
grew
all that.
up at the same time. I was going to say,
I was
watching anime before these guys were born.
Yes.
I watched
right there with
you. Did you watch? So there was another show that I didn't know it was anime. And I don't know if it would still be considered anime, but I know that it was animated by a Japanese studio, and it was called Jason the Wheeled Warriors, and it was
I'm vaguely familiar with that.
Plant vehicles is what they had. The one that I remember the most was just this fly trap vehicle. Man, that was a cool show. But,
There were some weird things that came out.
80s were weird in a beautiful way.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And I just took I've got 3 boys. I just took my 9-year-old and 6-year-old to see Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind in theaters because they're doing the Fathom event thing. So which is a really beautiful movie. If you haven't seen that.
Well, with all that background now, let's dive in a little bit into this particular production.
Yeah.
So this is going to be kind of in the vein of Japanese anime style from what I've seen from some of the pre-production stuff. So talk to me a little bit about what kind of storylines are we looking at? Now, you mentioned in your early work, this was you were looking at Bible stories that your daughter said, I would connect with this.
Yeah.
So talk to me a little bit about what kind of storylines are we going to see here? Is this direct Bible stories, or is this more allegorical, which I think's what Al said, where it's not necessarily directly biblical, but you can draw all the lines. Where does this fall?
Yeah, it's not a direct one-to-one retelling of any single Bible story,
Okay.
and it doesn't take place on Earth. It's not
Okay.
historical, but what it is sort of like if you think about Lord of the Rings, right, and what
Mhm.
Tolkien did with the world of Middle Earth, which was a world that was sort of shaped by Northern European mythology,
Mhm.
Germanic, Celtic, Norse mythologies, sort of, and folklore sort of shaped the world of Middle Earth. And then within that world, Tolkien also then lifted some of those narratives that came from those folklores and mythologies and mixed them into an allegoric story. Well, he wouldn't say allegoric, but a story that Lewis would be like, no, but
Depends on who you talk to.
a story that at the very least has some Christian thematics,
Yes.
if that's a way to put it, built in, right? And Lewis did the same thing, although Lewis would say his was an allegory.
Yeah.
And but Lewis created a world, Narnia, that's shaped by Arthurian legend and Greek and Roman mythology, and kind of created this amalgam world. I think that what we wanted to do is something similar to that, but I've been so enamored with the world that is presented to me in the story of Genesis that that it was like, what if you could have a fantasy world that is like Middle Earth or Narnia, but inspired by sort of that pre-Hebrew culture and the cultures of that sort of antediluvian world that we see in Genesis and sort of post-diluvian, right? What if you had a fantasy world that was inspired by those cultures and those stories? That's sort of what our world is. So yeah,
Okay.
it's not a historical biblical world. It is a fantasy world, but inspired by the cultures of Genesis.
Okay.
Yeah,
Very cool.
and just to give a little more on that, one of the reasons why we did that is because, like C.S. Lewis, like basically I talked to Jason, we went over this a while, and it was kind of like looking at, okay, why is it that the Chronicles of Narnia, Lord of the Rings are accepted around the world by pretty much anybody? And so it's like you can have, you don't have to be a Christian to like Lord of the Rings or to like Chronicles of Narnia. But those stories are still like, they're just steeped in the values, the morals, the truths of the faith, basically.
Yeah.
And so it was like, it essentially was like, so we essentially want to dip into fantasy and myth in order to essentially make it more accessible. And really, this came out of inspiration from Jesus and the parables, because it was kind of like we asked ourselves, like, when Jesus, talked to large crowds of people that weren't presumably super educated, it was like, what did he do? Did he quote, the Talmud? Was he quoting, ancient Hebrew text, or was he talking about, parables and principles where he kind of was doing a once upon a time, there was a man who owned a field, and, and telling stories like that. And so it's kind of like, go ahead, Jason, you want to say?
No, I was just saying, like, you can look at what Jesus did, and you can actually find in those parables the inspiration that he's pulling from the Torah. Like all those stories, I mean, they have the thematics and the philosophies that obviously Jesus was raised on and that was just set inside of his heart, but he's remixing it into a parable, right? And so, yeah, I think David's right on. Like, the idea is, could we create a world that honors and pulls from the rich textures of the Hebrew scriptures, and could we tell a story that takes the themes, the deep themes of the Old Testament, and remix that and tell those stories and marinate our narrative in some of those themes and philosophies. I think that Genesis 6, if someone had to pin us down and say, yeah, but what's the story really? Genesis 6 for sure. Like, we've taken that piece and we're extrapolating a myth story out of that, a parable out of Genesis 6. Would you say that's fair to say, David?
Yeah, no, for sure. And specifically, it's that line about, giants roaming land, right? That's really what started this whole thing, was like, what was that like? There were giants. There were these mighty men of renown who became like the men of legends. Who were those guys? And who were these sons of God coming down? And like, what was all this stuff? It seems very fantasy if you think about it from like, Lord of the Rings kind of perspective. It's kind of like, oh, like this. Yeah. You could look at this one way and see a lot of fantasy, a lot of parables in there. And so that was really like a lot of the inspiration, I think, for where we're going to be in season 1, at least.
And I think that we all have a deep respect for the scripture, honestly. Like, so this isn't about like the scriptures tell these stories in a beautiful way. Like, we're not trying to take away from that at all. We in fact, we honor them and love them. And, but we are infinitely creative beings. Like, and we come from an infinitely creative God, and his actual son reinterpreted and remixed the very scriptures into parables. You know what I mean? And so this feels like, and if anybody out there listens to the Bible Project podcast, you will hear Tim Mackey talk about every story that comes after the garden is essentially a remix. It's taking that story, remixing it into a new narrative, and then the next story takes those two stories and remixes them into the next narrative, and then that one and you've got these themes that just begin to come out of this. The garden theme shows up over and over and over and over again, because in every new generation of scribes would hyperlink back to the garden narrative, and then the next one would hyperlink back to the Exodus narrative. And so I think we want to kind of operate inside of that tradition to some extent. And I think that the themes that we're looking, particularly the themes that we've identified in Genesis, and particularly like Genesis 6 and 7 and 8 and 9, the story is surrounding themes of identity and purpose, rebellion, faith, and redemption. And so those are the core themes that we want to sort of deal with in particularly in season 1.
Great. Well, on kind of the production side, and maybe Al can speak to this, how is that all going to work? I mean, I guess, Jason, you were doing some artwork, but we need, but your background isn't necessarily animation. So how are we going to take that image of, what you've drawn or what you have in your mind, and we're going to get that into a production so that it actually works for, I guess streaming is probably where we're going here.
Yeah.
But how is that all going to happen? What needs to happen to make all that work?
So we're right now we've been doing tests with several studios overseas that have anime pedigrees, for lack of a better word. And so we've had lots of tests coming in. We've had one studio that the founders have worked on several of the biggest animes that you can name. Dragon Ball Z they've worked on, or Dragon Ball, which
yeah, they worked
Jason would know which one.
They worked on Dragon Ball Z, which when we went over there and got to see some cells like in their studio of Dragon Ball Z. It was like,
yeah. So, and then we have other studios who have worked with on stuff for Crunchyroll. So we're testing out several studios to see exactly that look, to find that exact look that we're after. And we've got some great studios, very talented. I mean, some of the stuff we saw today was fantastic. Yeah, that just came in today. So it's, we've got some capable studios that worked on some pretty notable projects. So and it's funny because I was thinking earlier when Jason was talking about Franklin Entertainment and getting a call back 4 months. One of the studios we reached out to, our first studio that we really want to work with, it took them about 4 months to get back to us. So it just seems to be the 4-month cycle. But anyway.
What's funny is that when I first started working, the reason I ended up parting ways with Franklin Entertainment was because what they wanted to do was basically sell the concept. So I was in kind of a similar boat. I didn't know what to do with it. I was like, I don't have the capabilities or skills, and I don't have any knowledge around this. But they were like, "Oh, it's fine." They're like, "What we're going to do is we've got a first look deal with Paramount Plus. We've got contacts at Netflix. They're like, we'll find a streamer. This show is going to get made because it's really good." And so, as they were prepping to, I believe they had reached out to an agent at Netflix, and they were engaging them. My wife and I just were praying about it, and honestly, I did a fast and. At the end of that fast, it felt extremely clear to me that was not the route to go. And I felt like the Lord said, trust, if you can partner with them and you can partner with Netflix, or you can trust me, invite me to be your partner, and we'll build something and we'll do this a different way. There's another way to do it other than going through that typical Hollywood model. And so I said, okay. And I called them back and I said, "Hey, thank you, but no thank you. I think this is where probably our partnership ends." And I had nothing. I didn't know what to do with it, but I knew, and I didn't know what was going to happen. I was like, this could be the end. I may be turning down the best thing for this show, but it just didn't feel like that was the right way to steward it. And so I said no. And that's when I reached out to David. And oddly enough, within a few months, I had an offer to go on as art director for a completely different show. Having never worked in that industry, I got a full-time offer to work as an art director for another animated series. And I learned the ropes I worked there for the last year and a half, learning how to engage and create all the pre-production that is required for an animated series, working with an overseas studio. And so the Lord put me in a position to learn everything I needed to learn to get me prepped for this. And so, then when Al came on, that was a sigh of relief because there was a minute where I was like, I don't know what we do here. And Al was like, well, we find a studio. And I was like, oh, cool. I was like, how are we going to draw this stuff? You can imagine me and Al every night, just drawing.
So, leaving Franklin, you're still playing around with this idea. Now, then you got the opportunity to pitch in a slightly different way. You want to talk about that a little bit and where you've kind of landed at this point?
Yeah. So I think that what happened was Franklin, the first thing they did was we need to find you a showrunner. We need to find you a writer, And so, I was like, okay, cool. And they looked at a bunch of different people, but they kept on coming back and they were like, the problem is that they were having a hard time finding a writer that they felt brought something additive to the project. They were like, what you've created is so, I'm not tooting my own horn here, but they literally were like, what you've created here is so rich and so unique that we want to find another creative that can come on and add to it, not just jump on and basically, make it as good as it already is. They're like, it's already good. We want someone that may come in and make it great. And so when I parted ways with them, still having not found anybody. So when I reached out to David and I looked at scripts, we had talked with a few different people. So I had a sense of what wasn't great. And so when I met with David and he turned in his script, where he kind of I gave him my script and he basically was like, I think we need to write a different script, a new script. Your notes were essentially like, how about a new script? But I loved that. I actually was not offended at all. I was like, okay, man, this dude's bringing it, and he's bringing something really fresh something. It felt additive. It felt like it made everything better. And so, so that's when we started working together on that. And somewhere in there, we started talking about Angel. I had reached out to Angel and kind of, again, I didn't know their process. I just went and found the email to one of the Harmon brothers and emailed them. And they were like, we have a submission process, so you can do that. This looks pretty cool, but you're going to have to submit, So David and I started kind of working on a plan to create what was needed to submit, and what was needed was actually an animatic pilot.
Okay.
And so we raised money. We raised capital from a private investor that believed in what we were doing, and cost about 25 grand or so to record, edit, get all the storyboards what did we ended up having 25 minutes. We cut it down, but actually I think it was longer, right? We ended up
we had long. We way over created. I mean, that pilot was like 30 something minutes, and I was like, holy cow, we gotta cut this down.
Angel was like, "This is good, but it's long." It was like.
It was great getting to know Jason, David, and Al. We talked so long that I decided to split this interview into 2 parts. Make sure you check back next week for part 2, and click down in the links below to follow the progress of the show. Well, that's all I have for you today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, follow, just click all those buttons down there. That way you can keep up with us anytime we put out new content. You can find all of our social links and links to our YouTube channel and our online store at ChristianNerdsUnite.com. And if you really do enjoy the show and want to help even more, consider becoming a supporter on Patreon. All of our Patreon levels have great benefits and make a huge difference in the ministry we're able to do. Supporters will also get to hear exclusive stories of believers we're serving around the world through our ministry partners. To check it out or to partner with us, go to patreon.com/ChristianNerdsUnite or ChristianNerdsUnite.com and click support in the menu. And don't forget to check out ChristianNerdHQ.com for more great podcasts. Before you go, I do want to leave you with this blessing from Ephesians 3. I pray that out of his glorious riches, he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power together with all the Lord's holy people to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. We'll see you next week. Blessings.
Hey